Bolshevik Revolution was a huge civil conflict in Russia that led to the end of the provisional government and replaced it with what would eventually become a powerful nation. Although the Bolshevik Revolution was very costly and bloody, it was the beginning of advancements and conflicts between the ideologies of communism and capitalism in Russia and worldwide. The men that made it and fought in it were the smartest and most powerful revolutionaries in history. As a result, the Bolshevik Revolution was the most important economic and political exploration in the 20th century because it turned a backwards and poor country into a world superpower that expanded communism throughout the world. The Bolshevik Revolution, the first steps to becoming a world superpower. Founded in February of 1917, the Provisional Government was a temporary revolutionary government that was set up after the abdication of the Tsar Nicholas II. The Provisional Government had many things going against it. First, the government kept the already collapsing nation in World War I, which the general public hated because of the humiliating defeats and over 5 million casualties. Secondly, they did not improve the terrible conditions in factories and farms. Also, the government had little power. The majority of the supplies were in the hands of the Soviets, Russian worker unions. Finally, their leader, Alexander Kerensky, was incompetent. He kept the nation in the war and did not use force to respond to the revolution until it was too late. However, they did have support from allied nations. The determined leaders of the radical Bolshevik Party exploited the weak provisional government to gain power and support of the nation. The Bolshevik Party thought that a communist government was the only possible revolutionary government. Communism is an economic and social system where the ideals are to create a people's society, where everyone works as hard as they can and gets as much as they need, and has no bourgeois businesses or monopolies that plague society. Communism was founded by German thinkers Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels, who wrote the Communist Manifesto and Das Kapital. However, Marx did not think that backwards Russia could support a revolution. He thought the Russian peasants were too illiterate and primitive, and Karl Marx's ideas center on an industrial middle class. However, the leader of the radical Bolshevik Party, Vladimir Lenin, disagreed with Marx and believed that Russia could support a revolution. Lenin was born Vladimir Ilyich Ulyanov on March 10, 1870, to Maria Alexandrovna Ulyanova and Ilya Ulyanov, and was raised in a middle-class family. When Lenin was 17, the hanging of his brother, Alexander Ulyanov, made him an angry revolutionary. In 1905, Lenin helped create the Bolshevik Party and became the most prominent leader of the party by writing letters, articles, and books. He promoted his cause to peasants and said, "The oppressed are allowed once every few years to decide which particular representatives of themselves are going to represent and repress them in Parliament." In 1917, after Tsar Nicholas stepped down, the Provisional Government was formed. Lenin immediately pressed for attack. The Bolsheviks tried to overthrow the Provisional Government by handing out pamphlets and taking to arms. However, the Provisional Government cracked down on the revolution during July, called the July Days. Prominent leaders were captured. Lenin barely escaped to Finland. Things, however, began turning up when General Lavur Kornilov tried to overthrow the Provisional Government. Kornilov was the image of the anti-revolutionary movement. Kornilov went to Petrograd to put down revolt and restore order, but paranoid Kerensky fired him in fear Kornilov would take over. However, Kornilov refused to leave his position and marched on Petrograd, trying to establish a military dictatorship to defeat rebels. To fight Kornilov, the provisional government gave the Bolsheviks and other revolutionaries weapons and freedom of speech to fight a common enemy. Trotsky was released and organized a Red Guard to fight Kornilov. The Bolsheviks took over food distribution in Petrograd and put up barbed wire. This power and political freedom led to the growth of the Bolsheviks. Germany, desperate for an edge against Russia, helped Lenin back into Russia to weaken the provisional government. Lenin quickly made preparations to take over the provisional government, claiming that history will not forgive us if we do not assume power now. Lenin hid in a small, poor community as Trotsky's Red Guard attacked. With the help of the Petrograd Soviet, who publicly denounced the provisional government, armed Bolsheviks poured into Petrograd and took over government buildings. Eventually, Bolshevik troops stormed into the Winter Palace of the provisional government and arrested its members. The Bolsheviks finally destroyed the provisional government at Moscow, and they had control. However, Lenin had barely taken control, and immediately a civil war began. The remnants of the provisional government, the Mensheviks, Tsar supporters, and other radical groups formed the White Armies and attacked the small Bolshevik-controlled lands. The White Armies quickly took control of most of Russia except for Petrograd and Moscow. The Allies, enraged that the Bolsheviks had closed the Eastern Front, reinforced the White Armies. However, the Bolsheviks had more industry and were well coordinated by Trotsky. He was a great military leader, and he led by the front. Russia's civil war lasted 2 years and was one of the most bloody and sad times in Russian history because of the extreme brutality used by both sides. After the 2 years, the last enemy general retreated by boat to fight another day, and the Allies exited the war. Russia was finally controlled by Lenin and became the Soviet Union. While leading, Lenin often adopted the ideas of others and used trial and error to try to create the perfect communist government. He experimented with democracy, but the people voted against Lenin, so he shut it down. In his April theses, he called for the abolition of the army and police, but realized that they were necessary and eventually created one of the largest armies on earth. These ideas were radical at the time for communists. He worked with Leon Trotsky, Joseph Stalin, Grigory Zinoviev, Clement Voroshilov, and other Bolsheviks to make his ideas more popular and to constantly improve them. Lenin put into effect a strict version of communism called war communism after the Civil War, but the economy spiraled downwards. He had to quickly institute the new economic policy, which allowed some economic freedom, businesses, and landowning. He left a surplus after he died in January of 1924. By the end of the Civil War, the Soviet Union was a huge superpower, controlling vast lands, and able to repel even the Nazi war machine in World War II. Over the past 100 years, as seen in events such as the space race,
CBS Television presents a special report on Sputnik 1, the Soviet
the
space
Cuban
mission.
Missile Crisis.
Shall be the policy of this nation to regard any nuclear missile launched from Cuba against any nation in the Western Hemisphere as an attack by the Soviet Union on the United States.
The Berlin Wall.
Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall.
The Vietnam War. Nuclear proliferation. Communist China. The Bolshevik Revolution has changed the world.